Violent clashes.
Sweden's gang wars
in a series of explosions linked to a gang war.
Det här är en svår tid för Sverige. Jag kan inte nog understryka hur allvarligt läget är. Sverige har aldrig förr sett något liknande. Inget annat land i Europa ser något liknande.
Less than a decade ago, Sweden had one of the lowest levels of gun crime in Europe. Now, they're the second highest. In Stockholm, gun violence is roughly 30 times that of London. The country is engulfed in a gang war, which is almost entirely run by people with a migration background. Sweden's famed welfare state and its lax asylum laws has made it a popular destination for immigrants. Since the 2000s, they've had a steady high number of new arrivals. But in 2015, it peaked at over 160,000. Of these non-Western immigrants, nearly half are unemployed. They are also 9 times more dependent on government welfare. They live predominantly in poor suburbs and are poorly integrated in Swedish society. This is where armed gangs recruit their members.
Explosions,
shootings, gang crime that's risen to unprecedented levels.
This is the rise and fall of Sweden with hindsight. It's worth mentioning that Sweden's gun crimes are still far below that of the United States. They have an average GDP per capita of $60,000, making them one of the richest countries on Earth. Their life expectancy is 83 years, and they have some of the best healthcare and education in the entire world. Sweden ranks at the top of the charts in many respects. But when it comes to migration, how well immigrants integrate, and how productive they become in society, Sweden is doing very poorly. I'm going to dive into that topic, but first, it's important to shatter the biggest misconception about Sweden. They're often regarded as a social democratic utopia, some kind of third way between capitalism and socialism. And people believe that nations can achieve similar social outcomes by expanding their size of the government, but that would be a misreading of history. Their famous welfare state that's taking such great care of the old, the sick, the unemployed, and a shocking high number of refugees is only a few decades old. Sweden became rich and successful before they adopted their comprehensive welfare system. In the 1870s, their economy was far below Northern and Western Europe, and their average GDP per capita was half that of Great Britain. 3/4 of their population lived off farming, which was an incredibly tough existence in this semi-Arctic environment. They developed a strong work ethic with an emphasis on hard work, individual responsibility, and family values. When the world began to industrialize, Sweden became the fastest growing economy in the world. Swedes were trustworthy, hardworking, and responsible. They remained neutral during both world wars and developed a much more moderate version of today's welfare state. Sweden's rise to prosperity was characterized by free market policies and limited state involvement. It wasn't until the 1960s that they underwent more drastic reforms to their welfare system. The concept folkhem, meaning people's home, gained popularity. It describes Sweden as a family, with citizens being expected to take care of each other like siblings. This philosophy partly explains Sweden's embrace of refugees. Today, their welfare state provides citizens, native or immigrant, with incredible benefits. When a child is born or adopted, each parent is entitled to 240 days of parental leave. A married retired couple receives payments that almost equal their pre-retirement income. Healthcare and education are mostly free and are amongst the best in the world. The state is very generous, but this needs to be financed through taxes. In 1950, the personal income tax was 21%. By 1995, it was raised to 52%. So how did all these changes affect the economy? This is their GDP growth. In this period, between 1968 and 1975, most drastic welfare reforms took place. They suffered quite a bit during the 80s, and again during the 90s. They were the 4th richest country in 1975 and the 14th in 1993. The employment rate hasn't improved that much. In 2014, it was only slightly higher than 3 decades earlier. Inequality in 2013 was about the same as in 1950. Let that sink in for a moment. The welfare state brought a lot of good, but it failed to improve a lot of other things that, granted, were already exceptionally good. But Sweden became rich, employed and equal before the introduction of big government. The nation developed a vision of Sweden functioning as a family, an inclusive and equal society, and that was extended to refugees. In 1987, 3% of the population were non-EU migrants. In 2013, this was already at 12%. And something curious was happening when these migrants moved to Sweden. One study shows that a group of immigrants who fled Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1980s and 90s were 2.3 times as likely to have a higher education as a native Swede. But once in Sweden, only 18% of them were employed. They're highly educated and from the upper class, so why aren't they working? In 2004, when the Swedish economy was performing strongly, one study showed the average income of Iranian immigrants was 65% that of a native Swede, whereas similar Iranian immigrants in the United States earned 136% compared to native-born residents. Clearly, migrants in the 80s and 90s were not integrating that well. Sweden's strategy for managing new arrivals was to distribute them throughout the country. The goal was to relieve pressure on the big cities, but what they often overlooked were the local economic conditions. On top of that, about 2/3 of jobs in Sweden are filled through informal means, which is challenging if you do not speak the language and you don't have a social network. All the while, the welfare state was providing for the basic needs and requirements of these migrants. Then in the 2000s, the type of migration changed. More migrants arrived for humanitarian reasons, with a peak in 2015 when Sweden took in 163,000 refugees in only 1 year. Most of them were from Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan, and were fleeing from conflicts at home. This led in 2011 to a staggering 20% of the Swedish population being of non-native descent. Many ended up in poor suburbs. They integrated poorly, they didn't feel as part of society, and many lived in poverty. They depended on government welfare. This was not only a burden on the state, but as it turns out, it was a breeding ground for criminal activity. The recent outbreaks of violence are between gangs that are ruled by second-generation immigrants. They recruit young teenagers from these poor neighborhoods. They were primarily involved in drug trade, but in recent years, they have infiltrated the government and even political parties, where they make money from fraud and other illicit activities. It is difficult to know exactly, but one study estimates that criminal organizations make around $500 million per year from this type of illicit activity. Over half of Swedish inmates serving long prison sentences are first-generation immigrants, and 45% of Sweden's unemployed are born outside Europe. This community has become a heavy burden on society. For most of the 2010s, the nationalist Sweden Democrats were a lone voice against immigration. They used to be a fringe party, but partly because of the migrant crisis, they have now become one of Sweden's largest political groups. The current Prime Minister of Sweden is breaking away from tradition. He supports tax cuts, free market policies, and economic liberalism, and he's working closely together with the Sweden Democrats. His right-wing coalition believes that the rise in gang violence is directly connected to Sweden's earlier immigration policies. His foreign minister said, "We can now see that outsideship and lack of integration in combination with trade of narcotics and organized crime is creating this very, very toxic mixture. It would be short-sighted to blame this violence only on migration. Government policies aimed at integrating migrants are partly to blame, and the situation escalated in a system that went perhaps too far in accepting new arrivals. But what makes it challenging is that this issue speaks directly to a core belief of Swedish identity.
Immigration is closely linked to the country's post-war economic boom.
So there is a historic understanding or sense that given some time, and this will be something positive for Sweden.
You make sure that they get jobs, to get somewhere to live, and they get a place in Swedish society. Otherwise, you just you create a problem.
The idea of fully returning to a capitalist society is not widely supported, but that reforms are desired can be seen in Sweden's current government policy. They are implementing racist policy. They are making it harder for immigrants from outside the European Union to get social benefits, and for children that have 2 foreign parents, preschool is now compulsory to help them learn the Swedish language. Sweden appears to be on a road towards increasing economic liberty and incentives for work within the scope of the welfare system. Could this be the end of their famous middle ground? Please consider watching one of these 2 videos next.